All right, joining us is Eric Cunningham from Elections Daily. Welcome to the show, Eric.
Hey, happy to be here.
So, how have things been going for you since you started Elections Daily? You started it earlier this year, right?
I actually started it, I think around November of last year, so that'd be November 2019. We
Yeah.
kind of got the idea, or I kind of got the idea earlier that year, and ultimately we decided to launch it after I got some other people who were interested in contributing, and went well. Went great during the election cycle, and we're still doing good right now. Obviously, we want to, when more elections come in, we'll have more content coming out. We have some stuff coming up about Georgia soon, and some other big projects we're excited to unveil after the new year. But we're definitely pleased with how the site is going and how people are, how people are reacting to it.
Definitely. What was the impetus behind starting this project?
Yeah, so I had been obviously election Twitter's been a thing for a while now. There's a lot of people who are really smart, have really good takes about elections, and kind of deserve to be, heard or have their voice out there. But it's actually pretty hard for some of this granular data stuff to get put out on any on other websites, especially if you don't have a background in mathematics or you don't have a background in journalism. So Elections Daily kind of was set up to give these people a chance to post their maps and their takes and stuff in a way that would last longer than a tweet and be easier to find than a tweet. But since then, it just kind of evolved into a lot of other things as well. But the initial impetus was giving people an opportunity outside of the traditional media outlets to have their voice heard.
Yeah, and you've had like a wide range of different commentators, and I do have to say, there was a period of time from like mid 2019 to earlier this year when the sort of the election night stream void was being filled by Decision Desk HQ. They had streams on their Twitch, but
Mhm.
it seems like they've stopped doing that, and you guys have stepped into that void and big time.
Yeah. Yeah, people have really liked our election coverage streams. Done those traditionally on election night for the major races. We had them on election night, the general election, but also a lot of primary elections. I don't think we've had an opportunity to do them for special elections yet. I assume we'll be doing a stream for Georgia, or we'll have some people on a stream for Georgia. But that was really our first general election opportunity, and I think it went pretty well. We planned it for a while. We've been kind of deliberate in trying to figure out the best way to, to present this stuff to provide the commentary and the analysis of these races, but without kind of the hot takes or the kind of the hackery you might find on some of the national media outlets like your Fox News, your CNN, or your MSNBC.
Right. And I actually watched the election night stream. I have actually watched many of the primary nights, but I watched part of the election night stream. And I noticed that, when we started getting the results from Miami-Dade County, I noticed that there was a change in sort of the tone of the coverage, like recognizing like, oh boy, something big is happening. Like what was the moment that night when you realized, oh boy, something's happening that we didn't anticipate?
Yeah, so it was probably one of two things, and I have to go back into the stream and look at it. I actually haven't rewatched most of these streams since we've posted them, but I believe it was either the Miami-Dade stuff where I think we might have assumed it was just one county. It might have just been the election day votes coming in. It might not be all the early votes in, but I think it was really when we saw the stuff coming out of South Texas. Um, we looked at this results. I had a friend from Texas who was texting me that Republicans were pulling 40% in Starr County, which is just wild that they were pulling, 30% in El Paso County. And when we started looking at, they'd won Zapata County. They'd, gotten close in places that they haven't been in for a while. I think that was when we kind of looked at things and we're like, something weird is going on. And it's not just Miami, which we'd kind of been attuned to. I mean, people have been talking about Miami as a area where Republicans hope to gain. They had gained in 2018. Republicans have been aggressively running ads there. They had two excellent congressional candidates down ballot, and of course Mario Diaz-Balart, so popular, he didn't have any competition in his district, which is mostly Hialeah and some white rurals that were kind of thrown in for population
he,
balance.
he almost faced a Democrat who I think was pro Castro.
Yeah, regardless of what it was, he didn't face an opponent, and that was a district that came pretty close to voting for Hillary last time. But I don't think anyone would have predicted. I think we thought maybe 40% as a threshold for Republicans in Miami-Dade would have been pretty dang impressive. Getting 46% there was not on anyone's radar, or the fact that Trump would have won Florida, even if he hadn't had those 200,000, more votes that had come in. And it was literally the 200,000 voters and had been gained for Trump. And I think Biden actually lost voters from
Yeah,
2016.
about
So
6,000 maybe.
yeah, so literally 100% of the, statistically speaking, of the new voters voted for Republicans. That is just absurd. I mean, that is wild. And we saw this in South Florida. We also saw it later in the year, or later in the cycle, once we started looking at some of these other states. Places like Chicago had swung a little bit Republican. Places like New York City or Los Angeles. Obviously, those weren't enough to flip those states or even come close to flipping them. But I think that was really when we saw those results coming in from South Florida and South Texas, we started to realize this might not be a blue wave. That this might be something very different than a blue wave.
Right. And you talk about the Latino shift, and I have to say that there was an opinion expressed by the YouTube channel Let's Talk Elections. I'm assuming
Mhm.
you've heard of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
He basically said that it chalked it up to the boy who cried wolf scenario, where in 2016 Democrats insisted that Trump being elected, would be an existential threat to many Latino communities, and when that did not happen, they decided to give Trump a chance, especially when Republicans, giving an effective anti-socialism message that really appealed to many Latino voters. So what I'm wondering is, given that Biden is going to be president, he has 4 years to dispel the Republican message that he would be a socialist. Could that turn back the clock in the next election?
Now, see, that I'm not sure of. Part of it obviously is a policy thing, but we actually did see somewhat of a swing of Latinos towards Trump from 2012 to 2016. That was already a thing. I know Republicans in Texas were working on that in 2018, which is why they did so well in the area, relatively speaking, as the rest of the state swung towards Beto. The Valley swung towards Cruz. It probably saved him from losing that race. And then obviously you had the socialism message, but I think there are other messages as well. I can't. I'm not going to spoil our interview later today, but interviewing the former congresswoman from Florida's 27th congressional district, she mentioned. Obviously, she's a moderate Republican. She's not someone who's a fire thrower, but she did mention that people were told doom and gloom about how Trump was going to do this and this and this, and it was going to be terrible for Hispanic communities. But then, 4 years later, they've, you have all this. And in addition to that, you have the defunding the police message, which did not work. I think that just decidedly was a terrible objective campaign slogan.
Absolutely.
You had abolishing ICE. I don't think people realize most of the ICE employees are not white; they're Hispanic, especially in South Texas, where these areas are monolithically Hispanic. I actually saw an article which made an interesting point. These areas on the border are not really diverse. They're very Latino, but they're not diverse. These areas, 85, 90, almost 100% Latino. In that area, is your most pressing concern racism? If everyone around you, almost everyone is of the same ethnicity as you, is that going to be a major concern for you? And it didn't seem to be. It seemed like a lot of these Tejano voters were really more culturally conservative as well. I know the abortion issue was really a negative for Democrats in South Texas, very religious area. Guns as well, possibly. This is not a lot of these are rural areas, and it is Texas, so it's not like there's a huge market for gun control. I think there were ultimately a lot of reasons, and the fact that it was a universal swing everywhere, not just in South Texas and in South Florida, but also in Chicago, also in New York City, especially in the Bronx.
What
Some of these
about Arizona
congressional
and
districts,
Colorado?
yeah, to a degree. I mean, even those border ones. California was another big one. Trump got over 10% of the vote in Compton. Compton is actually a majority Hispanic community at this point. I think he'd gotten around 2% in the last election. So obviously, going from 2% to 11% or 10% is big. It's not enough to flip an area. It's not even enough to be competitive there. But I think it is a shot across the bow for Democrats who did take the Latino vote for granted
Yeah.
and assumed that, these people will be on board with them regardless of the agenda. One other thing to mention is the Obama administration really did on the issue of immigration, it really disappointed a lot of Latino voters. Obama was known as the deporter in chief. Part of it was because of his administration, like it or not, built the cages. That was a pretty effective attack from Trump. Obviously, Trump used them as well, but he wasn't the one who instituted that policy or built them. He faced the heat for it, of course, and was probably justified because it was a terrible situation, indefensible, but it had been the case for a while. You also had the case where the Obama administration seemingly was more interested in protecting, violent criminals who would come into the country while deporting people for minor offenses like traffic tickets or really minor crimes that people would say, I mean, even people who want to deport, everyone would say these people probably should go last. You probably get rid of the actual gang members or the actual drug runners first. I think there's a lot of reasons why those areas flipped. And given I'm not Latino myself and I'm not from the area, I can't say for sure, but those are all things that I've heard as to why we saw that swing. And clearly it worked because this was a swing everywhere in the country of Latino voters.
Right. And I will say that I think that in terms, I think I told this to you, but in terms of South Texas, particularly the rural areas, I think that could be a sustained shift, in the same way that rural white working class areas in the Midwest, shifted to Trump, perhaps the GOP is attracting working class people of all ethnicities. Although interestingly enough, there's yet to be that substantial shift among African Americans in the Black Belt. It's happening a little bit, but not to the extent that we saw in South Texas.
Yeah, to a degree, we saw some of it. We did see Republicans flip a couple of nominally majority black districts, and I think Arkansas and some areas like that. And obviously, Trump did gain in places like in my home state, North Carolina, like in Northampton County, and some of these other counties in the rural northeastern part of the state. But obviously, that's not been something that's happened yet. I think it could in the long term if Republicans make a concerted effort to to look at the situation these people are in and say, we'll fix it. We'll bring in utilities. We'll bring in all the sort of stuff to try and make these areas stronger. We'll bring in investment, businesses, stuff along that lines. I think that would be the next step. As for the rural voters, I think that is definitely something that could be a thing in the long term. I mean, when is the last time you've seen an area, swing so considerably towards a candidate or towards a party, and then
2016.
yeah, and then see it go away after a cycle, right? I mean, you might see a little bit of maybe under Biden, you could see a little bit of a revert to the mean. I think we saw that in 2012, where Mitt Romney didn't improve with the white working class voters, but he did win places back like Chester County. He did gain votes back in Orange County, San Bernardino, Riverside, places like that. So I think that could be a possibility, a little bit of a temporary snapback, but to some degree, Democrats are going to have to reckon with the policy differences they have with these communities and provide an agenda for these voters that is compelling enough to make them overlook things like abortion or like religion or like gun control. And ultimately, that's a fairly hard thing to do. When your party is ultimately trending towards being a coalition of the urban poor and wealthy urban and suburban people, mainly white urban and suburban people, that's going to be challenging to appeal to some of those rural voters, I think.
I mean, I will say that I could very well see a situation in which in which within the Rio Grande Valley itself, I could see a situation in which there is a divergence between, say, rural areas like Zapata or Valverde County, and on the one hand, and say Cameron, Webb, and Hidalgo counties on the other. Those places obviously home to Brownsville, Loretto, and McAllen. I could see an urban versus rural shift within that region. And I would love to figure out a way to make a map of this, but I have an idea of a winning coalition for Democrats in Texas that involves losing like 7 of these counties that in the Rio Grande area that Biden actually carried, and instead flipping Collin, Denton counties in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and Bell County, which is home to Killeen and Temple.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be ultimately challenging because it's not like the areas are that different. I mean, obviously there's urban and suburban areas there, but Hidalgo did see a massive swing towards Republicans went from a 27% or 28% Trump county to a 41% Trump county. I think we saw a similar swing in Cameron, which is the more traditionally Republican, as far as Texas goes, it's the more traditionally Republican compatible county. I think George Bush was able to win it in 2004. So these counties are urban to a degree, but they're also still they are a little bit different. I mean, and obviously there is one other thing to concern with here, which is that a lot of the voting in this area goes through I believe they're called politicures, which are these women who kind of are responsible for helping elderly people vote, helping people who are and giving endorsements for the community to vote for, and their voice is traditionally seen as pretty pretty authoritative. It's why you see some of these families lasting a long time in South Texas. If I think ultimately, if Democrats want to hold South Texas, they're going to need to worry about keeping people like that in their fold, these influential people in these communities. Um, but
Right.
ultimately, I'm not sure there's a huge separation at this point between somewhere like a Star County and somewhere like a Zapata County. Obviously, Zapata went for Trump, but in terms of the competitiveness, they weren't that far off.
Right. And I actually did not know that about these influential figures that decide elections in that's or sorry that decide how many of their followers would vote. It sounds a bit like how many Orthodox Jewish communities, particularly Hasidic communities in Lakewood and Brooklyn, how their votes are decided. Because in
Kind yeah,
yeah, many
yeah,
of these.
kind of similar. I would say it's closer to Souls to the Polls if you're familiar with that with black voters, but there is a degree of authoritativeness in terms of a respected community elder or a respected community worker telling you to, this is a candidate who you can support.
Right. So I guess one of the questions I'm wondering is, with everything that we've discussed, is it fair to say that states like Florida, Texas, and I guess North Carolina, the GOP has found a way to keep them light red, whereas in Georgia and Arizona, both seem to be going the way of Virginia and Colorado a decade ago?
I think I'm cautious. I'm cautious to give an authoritative answer. I do think one common trend with the states where Democrats are gaining, are switching these states long term is the presence of one giant anchor metro area. Call it the one giant metropolitan area, if you will.
Mhm.
Virginia flipped because of Northern Virginia, because of those counties, Fairfax, Loudoun, and Prince William. If those counties weren't there, the state doesn't flip nearly as early. And the presence of that metropolitan area is enough to make Republicans have a very difficult time winning the state. Um, you see a similar trend in Colorado, where increasingly the Denver metropolitan area is the dominant metropolitan area in the state. There's other smaller ones like Boulder, Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and then some of the ski communities. But ultimately, unless you win those suburban areas around Denver, you're not going to be winning Colorado. I think Georgia is looking to trend in that direction, where you need to do well in Atlanta, where over half the population lives in the Atlanta metropolitan area, the media market, where over half the population of Georgia lives. You're not going to be winning that state if you're losing. I mean, if you're not polling, you're polling under 40% in Gwinnett County or 40% in Cobb.
I mean, I
Long
remember a time.
term,
Go ahead.
oh sorry. Keep in mind that those suburban counties in Georgia, Gwinnett and Cobb County, both of them are about as large as Mecklenburg and Wake counties in North Carolina. Those are the two largest counties in North Carolina, Mecklenburg and Wake, over a million people each. Same in Gwinnett and Cobb. Or not, I think actually Gwinnett. Cobb has a little bit fewer at this point, I think. But when you think about in Georgia, that's suburban county. That's traditionally Republican. Whereas in North Carolina, those are the urban strongholds of Democrats. Um, that's part of the problem, right? In North Carolina, there's not a single anchor metropolitan area. If you want to win North Carolina, you have to run ads around Asheville, Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, Raleigh, Fayetteville, and then a lot of other minor ones like Wilmington as well, but a lot of other minor ones like Rocky Mount, Hickory, Boone, you know, Lumberton. Um, there's basically North Carolina is a diverse state in terms of where the population spread is. Whereas if you look at Georgia, it's frankly not. And if you look at Virginia, frankly, it's not. Most of the population now is concentrated in the Northern Virginia suburbs and the Richmond suburbs to a lesser degree. It's just a geographic challenge for Republicans there. Whereas in Texas, yeah, Republicans can afford to lose a little bit of steam in Tarrant or in Collin and Denton. But if they keep gaining votes in the Rio Grande Valley, if they hold their own in Harris County, which they did, they snapped back a little bit in Harris. Um, Even minor ones like El Paso, large metropolitan areas like that, they could
Snap
hold
back.
on for quite.
Wait, just what? Snap back in comparison to Clinton or Beto O'Rourke.
In comparison to both, they can. I mean, you could comfortably be at 6-7% for a while if you keep gaining in these Latino communities and pull them closer to what you would expect from a rural white area, or even from just winning them. You can afford to lose a little bit of steam in the Dallas Fort Worth or the Austin areas, whereas in Virginia, Republicans frankly cannot afford to lose any more votes in Northern Virginia. In Colorado, Republicans will have no chance at winning elections if they keep bleeding votes in Denver. That's part of the problem. Whereas in North Carolina, like I've said before, uh, Democrats are losing votes in large chunks of the state. They're losing votes in large urban, I mean, in counties like Robeson, which has over 150,000 people, if I recall right. And Republicans still have strength in the suburbs. They're gaining in a lot of these areas. So it's not the same comparison you get from a Georgia, where the places Republicans are gaining are basically universally the places where people are dying. And that's not a sustainable path for a party.
Right, and just to talk a bit more about North Carolina, Democrats were widely expected to unseat Tom Tillis and I think win all but two of the offices of the Council of State. And in the end, they flipped no statewide offices. Cal Cunningham lost to Tom Tillis. Trump carried North Carolina, and I believe Republicans won, what is it, two Supreme Court seats?
We swept every statewide judicial race. So we won 5 Court of Appeals races as well as all 3 Supreme Court races that were on the vote.
So does that chalk up to everything that you've just discussed about North Carolina? Like, what
Uh,
happened?
so what happened? It's the same thing that's happened apparently in 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016. Democrats they won the state once. They've won exactly 2 federal elections in North Carolina this century: 2008 Senate, 2008 presidential. After that, they seemed convinced they were invincible and could never lose again in North Carolina. Um, and then, frankly, they've not won anything since then. They gained some judicial races in 2018, but they didn't flip any House seats. They didn't flip the legislature. Um, like, I think part of the problem here is that North Carolina Democrats are running in a state that does not exist yet. They seem to think they can win only with Wake and Mecklenburg and just Guilford and just running out the clock on everything else. But in reality, whatever they're trying has clearly not been working, because 2012, 2016, 2020, they made major efforts to win North Carolina. They held the Democratic National Convention here in 2012 in Charlotte. Um, in 2016, they thought they had the state in the bag, and then in 2020 they thought they had the state in the bag, and then ultimately all their candidates underperformed. Even Roy Cooper won re-election by only 4%. He was expected to win by like 10. um, I think Democrats are just fundamentally not realizing that North Carolina is kind of the new Florida. There's lots of metropolitan areas Republicans are gaining unexpectedly with minority voters that you would not have expected them to gain with years before. And in the rest of the state, Republicans still have room to gain in the rural areas and in the ex-urban areas. Um, I think, and also part of its candidate quality. Cal Cunningham was not a good candidate. He simply was not. He was a fundraiser. They've tried this generic. I've made a meme about it on Twitter, but it seems like every candidate they run is basically a white male lawyer, which is fine, but like that's what their party is at this point. I mean, they're a party of lawyers, which, I mean, that's kind of limited. I think they need to realize that they're not going to win North Carolina back without expanding into Republican areas and without making outreach to these Republican rural communities that are just increasingly turning red. Maybe in 10 to 20 years they could just win with Wake and Mecklenburg alone, but they're already pulling 70-60% of the vote in these counties. Um, they could always pull more, but like I think fundamentally they don't understand that North Carolina, just because it went blue once, does not mean it's going to go blue every time. And clearly it's gone blue almost no times since 2008. They won the governor race, they've won some statewide races, but those have been in decline as well. They're down to 4 statewide offices now. If Republicans had nominated a competent auditor candidate, they'd probably be down that office. I mean, their party at this point is Roy Cooper. It's Elaine Marshall, who is old and is not going to run statewide. And even when she's tried, she's failed. And it's Josh Stein, who has underperformed in attorney general races against 2 Republicans who were so massively outraised. It's not even funny.
Yeah, speaking of Josh Stein, let's talk about a fun hypothetical. Let's talk about Josh Stein versus Mark Robinson for governor in 2024.
Mhm.
How exciting would that be? Because I have to say, I did not expect Mark Robinson to win the lieutenant governor's race, considering that he made, quite frankly, anti-Semitic comments during the race, and he won anyway. Like Democrats,
Oh,
not.
it wasn't. Yeah.
Yeah,
To be fair,
yeah,
it wasn't during the race. It was years before the race. It was as a private citizen, but
but when he
yeah,
was
they were
confronted
not
about it,
good
he did
comments.
not apologize. He stood by those
Yeah,
comments.
yeah. I expected him to win, and I expected him to have no problem winning for the most part because the poll showed it. But also, there was no enthusiasm for the Democrat. One thing Democrats need to realize about North Carolina: we're not a gun control state. Even the liberals here generally like guns to a degree. I mean, unless you're like some hardcore liberal in Chapel Hill, but even these municipalities have been put in their own rules. Um, the Democrat, Yvonne Lewis Hawley, ran almost entirely on gun control, on an assault weapons ban, on other forms of gun control, was backed by Michael Bloomberg. Whereas Mark Robinson ran basically a pro gun campaign. That was one of his major, and that was what brought him onto the scene. So Republican voters were fired up because they had a candidate who's going to support gun rights, and Democrats had a candidate who supports an assault weapons ban, which is not something North Carolina voters are really interested in. If you look at exit polling, the vast majority of North Carolina voters identify as conservative or moderate. Liberals are only around 20% of the electorate here. There's not a huge audience for them outside of Asheville, outside of Chapel Hill, and maybe some affluent areas in Wake County. I would say Wake County and Durham as well. Um, Most of the Democratic strength here is really people who identify as moderates, and a lot of them are people who are not interested in gun control on a political level. Um, Democrats didn't even have the advantage of race, having a diverse candidate in that race because both of the candidates were black. Yvonne Lewis Holly would have been the first black woman elected, I think, to the lieutenant governor's office, but Mark Robinson's the first black man elected to the office. So, I mean, I think his comments are regrettable, and I'm not excited about the prospect of him running in 2024. But I also don't think Josh Stein is some terrific candidate. He basically has 4 years to fix the rape kit problem that has been a thing since 2000, since the moment Roy Cooper took office. We've had a massive rape kit surge in North Carolina. He said he fixed it twice. Josh Stein has now said he's fixing it, and I hope he is because it's frankly a miscarriage of justice and an abomination what has happened here. How people have used the Attorney General office as a stepping stone for higher office while literally ignoring the plight of women who have been raped. If he has fixed that, then he may have a chance. He may have a good chance at running, but it comes to a point where I'm honestly not sure the comments Mark Robinson says would matter, given Josh Stein really honestly isn't that strong of a candidate. In 2016, the Republican was a garbage tier recruit who ran almost heavily against the bathroom bill, ran a very LGBT or very anti-LGBT platform, and he still almost won. And in 2020, we had a great candidate, Jim O'Neill, who was a terrific candidate. He had great experience in Forsyth County, a blue county, as the district attorney. He just didn't have the funds to compete with Josh Stein. So, and again, Josh Stein is this white male attorney, and another candidate Democrats have wanted for Senate is Jeff Jackson, who's a white male attorney. You'll notice the problem here is that it seems like it's on repeat. North Carolina is just on repeat where Republicans are running conservative candidates and doing fine, while Democrats are just kind of churning out these lawyers who are just barely personable that have issue winning. I ultimately don't know how that race would go. I think Josh Stein would probably be favored to a small degree because what Robinson has said is it's offensive. But Robinson also has 4 years to establish himself as the LG. It's a little bit too far to look ahead. What I do know is that Roy Cooper has basically spent all his political capital trying to get a Democratic majority in the legislature. so we can get Medicaid expansion done. And he failed. And now basically he's in a situation where there'll be 8 years of a Democratic governor with very few accomplishments that have been achieved. Um, Josh Stein can run on that, but from a practical level, it's going to be a challenge unless Democrats are able to make some progress back in 2022.
Yeah, and if in terms you talk about lawyers, there are candidates like Jenna Wadsworth who are not that, but I don't think someone like her would be any better given
No.
The TikTok video that she made. But
Yeah, she did the worst of any Democrat running statewide, and that's not a coincidence because she was a hardcore Bernie Sanders progressive in North Carolina. That's not something we're too interested in here.
Yeah. So I guess, is there any other states that we should look out for? Because you mentioned how major metropolitan areas, states like Georgia and Virginia, there seems to be not a lot of hope for Republicans if they're pursuing their current strategy. But in a place like Arizona that is dominated by Maricopa County, I believe that is just 60% of the vote is there. But
it's a massive chunk, yeah.
Yeah, but there's also the Latino factor, because is there some hope for Republicans in Arizona given that?
I think there's hope if the party stops going insane. The first step for that would be not voting Kelly Warden for a second term as state party chairman. She has turned the party into a parody of a political party, an absolute joke. A party that is so blatantly incompetent and so morally repugnant that it really is hard to picture a lot of people voting for it. If you look at their Twitter account, it's basically serving as Kelly Ward's alternate account. It's almost cultish in its devotion to Donald Trump. And when he's out of office, that's not really a compelling message. And it's not a compelling message right now because they just lost 2 Senate seats in a row. They lost the House race majority. Granted, they won the popular vote in the House. Not a surprise, as I mentioned before, Arizona's map skews about 3 points to the left. So even if Republicans won the House popular vote by around 3%, they would probably still be projected to lose a majority of seats. They're honestly lucky they didn't lose the legislature at this point. I think in the long term, there are 2 states nearby that Republicans have a much better chance in. That's Nevada. And mainly because they did a lot better in Clark County. They actually gained substantially in Clark County. They lost votes in Washoe, but in Clark County, they did pretty well. And if they can continue to gain votes in Clark County, the state will continue to go back to them because Clark County is where the majority of the population in Nevada lives. The other state is, interestingly enough, New Mexico. New Mexico is the prototypical one big metropolitan area state. It's dominated by Albuquerque. And then there's ones like Las Cruces and a couple other areas, but it is interesting for Republicans in that they do have a pathway to victory because it's a very diverse state. Basically, right now, the Democratic coalition is Albuquerque whites, rural Hispanics, and rural Native Americans. They're probably not going to lose those Albuquerque white voters as well as the white people in some of these other larger metropolitan areas. But if Republicans could cobble together enough Hispanic voters and enough Native American voters, that's enough to flip the state, even without worrying about Albuquerque. I would honestly consider New Mexico to be a much more competitive state for Republicans in the near future than Colorado. The presidential election there was closer. The Senate race was closer. Mark Ronchetti only lost the state by 6 percentage points, and he was barely supported by national Republicans. Those are 2 states I think would be interesting for Republicans long term. A couple other ones that they could focus on in the long term are Maine. Maine obviously is a different type of state. They need to kind of gain back with some of these secular white voters up there. But it is a state that's shown a willingness to vote for Republicans at the federal level now, Susan Collins. In 10 to 20, 30 years, I could see places like Rhode Island, Connecticut, or even Oregon being more competitive. Oregon would kind of depend on places like Republicans gaining not in the suburban areas around Portland and also in the lumber communities. But I think Rhode Island in particular in 20 years could be much more competitive than it is right now. It's experiencing a population decline, and the rural areas that are around Providence are gaining in Republican strength, relatively speaking. So that would be one to look at, but these are obviously all small states. They only have, I think, New Mexico has 5 electoral votes, if I recall right. I think Nevada has 5. Rhode Island only has 4, and it's going to be down to 3 next time. So these are all kind of states with a limited electoral appeal.
I do want to correct something. From 2016 to 2020, Trump's share of the vote did increase, but his margin was smaller.
Which one?
New Mexico.
New Mexico. Yeah, but no, I don't believe I was talking the. No, I mean I was comparing it to Colorado.
To
It
Colorado.
was yeah, it was closer than Colorado this cycle. I think Biden won Colorado by around 15, and Trump won New Mexico or lost New Mexico by around 11 or 12. Part of that's the Gary Johnson factor. He's made 2012 and 2016 kind of a pain to look at in terms of where the votes are because he took a lot of votes away from both parties. But the fact that it's closer than Colorado, a state Republicans actually put money into, kind of tells you what the Republican strength is long term. If they can win those border Hispanics, they could have a fighting chance in New Mexico. But that's kind of a stretch state for them. That's a 10 year, 15-year goal.
I mean, you talk about the mentioning that Oregon, Connecticut, Rhode Island could possibly wander onto to the competitive board. What I'm wondering is if Kansas and Nebraska could also wander on in the other direction, given the dominance of Kansas City and Omaha.
Nebraska, no. Nebraska is still very, very Republican. It's been pretty close. It's been actually not been pretty close. It's been pretty static the last few elections. The Democrats would need to do a lot better, not only in Omaha, but in places like Lincoln to be competitive in Nebraska. It's just simply not a viable one. Kansas is a weird state. I think they've kind of already reached their peak in Sedgwick, not Sedgwick, in
Shawnee?
Kansas City. Yeah, Shawnee, Kansas City area, Johnson County. They have room to gain, and Democrats do. But it's a challenging state because the rurals are so red, and that's not going anywhere. I mean, if Democrats started to pull really good margins in places like Wichita and Manhattan and all these other minor counties, then maybe. But I mean, let me look at this real. I want to see actually how close this thing was because, you know, it was closer than 2020, but I'm not actually sure it was materially that much closer than the 2008 presidential race.
Right. Kansas did vote to the left, I believe, vote to the left of Missouri for the first time in a long time.
Yeah, Missouri, that was interesting. But yeah, if you actually look at the vote totals, yeah, exactly what I thought. John McCain won Kansas 56.5 to 51.6. Trump won Kansas 56.2 to 41.5. So really the Democratic vote share has just gone back to where it was in 2008. They need to do a lot better in all of these urban counties to be competitive in Kansas. And I'd actually be concerned with Laura Kelly's prospects in 2022 because there was no Chris Kobach on the ticket. Obviously, this is a smaller state. Long term, Democrats might be able to do it if they can start pulling Stalin-esque margins in Johnson County. But, a Trump plus 15 state is still a Trump plus 15 state. That's a lot of people. And even when I say Oregon could be competitive, I'm not talking flipping it. I'm talking maybe being within 8 points in 20 years. I mean, I think we're, yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I think it was within 4 points in 2004.
Yeah, but that was with a third party. Oregon was kind of a weird state. Oregon and Washington in 2004 were kind of unusual in that they were closer than expected. Oregon was kind of a swing state at that point. Republicans did really well in the suburbs. Obviously,
it was close at that time.
Yeah, obviously it was close in 2000, but that was because of Ralph Nader. And then Washington was also fairly close, but I'm that's still left of the country. I honestly don't think that in the near future Oregon is a viable one, but in the distant future, I think it's one of the few you could kind of look at and say, yeah, there's a potential there.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about the Georgia runoffs, because this is going to decide control of the Senate. How do you see the races as they're developing now?
I think Democrats seem generally happy with the early vote totals. I think Republicans seem pretty convinced they have the election day votes. So I would say there's still toss-up races. I think really it's going to depend on how many people turn out on election day. If Democrats have just taken all of the early votes and just voted early and have just neglected election day, which is entirely possible. A lot of the models seem to think that election day is going to go the same as the November election, but early vote's going to have way more Democrats. Then yeah, you could get a potential where Democrats win those races fairly easily. But if it's the other way around, where Democrats cannibalize their election day vote totals by voting early, and Republicans just all vote on election day, then you can see the exact opposite. Keep in mind, Republicans did win the popular vote for both of these races in the in the primary. Republicans combined to win by about 1 point in the special, which was that's the Loeffler Warnock race. And then in the Purdue Ossoff race, Purdue finished ahead of him by about 2 points. And Ossoff ran about 100,000 votes behind Biden. So I would give the marginal edge to Republicans if they have that election day turnout, but I'm really not sure. I think they really are in the pure toss-up category at this point.
Yeah, and just to imagine, like a month ago, we didn't think that this would be the case. We think that Republicans were favored, and now, honestly, I'm not sure anymore.
Yeah.
And I actually find it really interesting. I believe that Elections Daily's prediction was Florida, North Carolina go blue, Georgia goes red, and it was the opposite across all those states.
Yep. Crystal Ball was the only one who called
Florida for Trump.
Yeah, who called Florida for Trump, Georgia for Biden, but North Carolina they got wrong. But I think North Carolina was the only one they got wrong.
Yep.
And it's really hard to fault them for that.
Yeah, it's one of the things I often see Miles Coleman bragging about is after, I believe 4 years ago they got it really wrong, but this year they were nearly spot on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And anyway, any final thoughts that you want to say as the year closes out in terms of like any big plans that Elections Daily has coming up for this coming year?
Obviously, stay tuned. I mean, that interview should be out by the time this podcast is up. So definitely go check that out on our YouTube channel or on our Anchor podcast site. We're interviewing former congresswomen and former congresspeople over the next few weeks. We also have a couple interesting projects that I'm excited to announce that we're not going to announce until after the new year. But they are two fairly sizable efforts. One of them is a collaborative effort among multiple people throughout election Twitter, a large number of people. And we're really excited to show that, which I think we'll announce it on January 1st. But definitely stay tuned for that. Pay attention to our Twitter account and all that.
Cal, I almost called you Cal Cunningham.
Yeah, we're not related. Just for those who are, there are not many Cunninghams in North Carolina or South Carolina, but I'm not related to Cal or Joe, as far as I know. And Cal has been exiled from the clan. He has been from our Cunningham clan, or Clan Cunningham is what we call in Scotland. He is in exile. He's no longer part of the community of Cunninghams. So please, and this was after the barbecue incident. This was not after the affair thing. He was done. This is purely a barbecue-based decision. So,
Eric Cunningham, editor of Elections Daily, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, and all the best to Elections Daily on everything that's coming up.
Yep.